everybody for coming to this joint colloquium between the Department of Earth, Environmental and Planetary Sciences and IBES. Our speaker today is Andy Revkin, who is now the senior reporter for ProPublica on climate and related issues. Many of you probably know him through his writing in the New York Times and through the .Earth blog that he wrote for a number of years. He also was affiliated with Pace University before joining this new position at ProPublica, which is a recent thing. He has lots and lots of awards. Some that are interesting to our types are that he has won the Robert Cohen Award for Sustained Achievement in Science Journalism, which is given out by the AGU. And in 2003, he won the joint National Academies Communication Award from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So there are many things to say about him. One of my favorite things about him is that he also plays music with Pete Seeger. So everyone, welcome Andy Revkin.
My most important achievement is I graduated from Brown University in 1978. Before a lot of things. And actually it was Brown, they used to give out a fellowship. I guess they don't do this. The Arnold Fellowship, which basically 3 people every year got to go do something really unusual somewhere. And my unusual thing was to study man's relationship to the sea in isolated island communities. And that was, you can't hear it? Let me, you know what, maybe I'll, can you turn up the, or I'll just eat the mic, but this would be rather awkward. I'll do it if I need to. Hold on 1 second. I had no interest in journalism, essentially. Here at Brown, I was not on the, oh, that's way too loud. You're forcing me too loud. I'll just do this if I need to. I don't know why it's, but there's a background thing. And that used to be my blog. Why is there and hold on, my PowerPoint is opening up. We'll get there, But they have to, the sound is overdosing. It's too yeah. It's too high and too low at the same time. We're good. I'll do this. And now I'm opening the top. And we've only lost. No, it's the audio off the computer that's coming. I think that's too loud. But we'll get, don't worry about it. Don't even worry about it. We'll get there. Maybe we'll get there. Hold on 1 more second. It must be the Trump administration doing this. Come on. While I'm waiting for this to open up, I'll go to the topic of current events, because I'm going to explain why I'm at ProPublica after 30 years of doing journalism in other ways. I was essentially stopping doing journalism. I was working at Pace University. I've been there for 6 years, teaching, doing documentaries with students, and doing my blog .Earth at the New York Times. But on a here we go. But on a informal basis, a contract, like an annual freelance contract. And what was starting to happen on my blog, this is actually worth saying before we get to this, is I'd started to see the same patterns over and over again. I started .Earth in 2007 when I was still a news reporter at the New York Times. And the .Earth blog was my way of getting at the more prismatic aspects of the problems like sustainability that didn't fit into conventional news articles. You write an article, the news process chronicles stuff that happened today, that might happen this week, or, the presidential cycle, And how wrong did we get the presidential race, right, in the media? So if you try to get too predictive in the media, it doesn't really work very well. And then think about the limits of how conventional media tell you about what's going on in the world, and think about the climate problem in that context. You realize it's a pretty bad fit. So blogging was kind of a way to work, it was a workaround. A blog is an ongoing conversation with readers about complex problems. At least in my case, that's why it was a good fit. But I started seeing the same pattern emerge, where I'd be covering a resilience issue, and I knew already why some community failed to build properly in a flood zone, because I'd already understood why that happens. Those patterns were repeating enough that I thought, I'm not learning anymore from my blog. And so why am I doing it? I know the basic parameters of why we're getting things wrong and the things that we sometimes get right in pursuing sustainability. And then along came this opportunity at ProPublica, which before Trump was elected or anything, they got some funding. It's a nonprofit journalism model, investigative. ProPublica is Latin for the public, in other words, in the public interest. Everything they do is framed around, for me to get a story through that process and published by ProPublica, it has to satisfy these core requirements. One is the issue has to have moral force. Moral force is right there on the propublica.org website. The other is public, in the public interest and with moral force. In other words, mostly making journalism that helps make people's lives better, and particularly focusing on the disenfranchised, the underrepresented, the abused. And they came up with this job to cover climate. And I saw this, someone emailed it to me, and I went, oh, that's interesting. But so it's basically an investigative model. Most of their stories, if you go to the site, they're like, they're a gotcha story. Someone did something bad, try to hide it, you reveal it, you win a prize, and the world gets a little better. But think about that in the context of climate change. And sure, there's lots of those stories to tell, but I'm old enough now, 60, that I don't want to spend, let's say, the next 20 years, if I'm lucky, writing incremental stories that aren't capturing the full scope of what this climate thing is. And to me, it's much, much bigger than the incremental things. So I wrote them an application. I applied for the job, even knowing that, wait, this is investigative journalism, maybe this won't work. And I said, what you're going to read below, what you'll read in my proposal, will be very different than all the other journalists who are applying for this great job. It'll say that some of the targets in my investigation of the climate problem will be terms, not people. Like, there are plenty of bad actors, those issues. But one of the characters I'll be pursuing is inertia. Like, inertia is a bad guy. Inertia is how systems take time to change, especially a system that took a long time to build, like the energy systems we now rely on. And that's inertia. Scale. How many of you work in the climate policy arena who you see some bright idea, like a new battery for a car, and then the first thing you say is, well, okay, can that be done at scale, at climate scale? And the simplest distillation of climate scale is like a wedge. This is the Robert Sokolow's idea that, well, if you can get, between now and 2050, if you can get me up to 1 billion tons a year of avoided CO2, now we're talking climate, right? That's something that the climate system would notice. And when I was doing this reportorial exercise of looking at scale and the many things, the bright ideas that are out there, it's a killer. So there's scale, there's inertia, and then of course there are motivated people who don't want to get us off of fossil fuels, and many other, and then there's the perceptual issues with how humans perceive risk. So I'm just going to quickly take you on and I am going to jump forward so we save enough time for a lot of conversation. My Anthropocene journey, and vault forward to this question of, like, how do we get real about some of these things that are facing us in this century? And then can you even have the idea of a good Anthropocene has been an interesting question. And even the word Anthropocene, of course, is an interesting question. Like, the geologists and stratigraphers who examine this question are still very divided on whether you can justify this idea that there's a human-caused epoch unfolding that will have this for millions of years, we'll have this record in the rock that people can point to, for better or worse, and say, oh, that was us. This came to the fore. I've been thinking and talking about the Anthropocene in other iterations for decades. And I gave a talk at Pace University, I think about 4 years ago, on the prospect for a good Anthropocene. And my friend Betsy Colbert, who wrote the book, The Sixth Extinction, and before that wrote her book and her New Yorker series on climate change, she tweeted this tweet, which was really funny. 2 words that probably should not be used in sequence, good and Anthropocene. She was referring to Clive Hamilton, an environmental ethicist in Australia, who's a very dark thinker, but a very, very deep thinker on issues of Earth systems and sustainability. And he had written an essay saying that any talk of a good Anthropocene is delusional. I think that was the word. So and then Clive and I engaged later in a conversation facilitated by another writer at Grist, and we found that actually we had a lot of common issues, common thoughts about this. It's not just good. You can have a good journey, a good path, even in a horrible moment in history. That's totally doable. So here it is. You know all these curves, or the basic idea. We're in zoom mode, right? Everything about humanity right now has been like this since about 1950. Zoom, 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 and with some other things that were happening long before that. And the current idea of the Anthropocene is that right around 1950 is the best sort of starkest little juncture when you can say, wow, something really is changing there. There's bomb testing, a huge burst of increase in resource use, fossil fuels, but you can see some of these curves are actually starting to modulate. And if you look even more at the drivers of change right now, like our mobility, our use of energy, there's been papers written already about peak transportation, peak car, Google for peak car. And in the United States, we seem to be heading toward you're not going to just have ever more cars, because all you young folks are just doing the Uber thing, and car sharing will become the thing. And of course, autonomous vehicles can greatly reduce the need to have all these extra vehicles. And then there's, of course, this one, the CO2 Keeling curve. The Keeling curve is just since 1958, but you can go to the UCSD, the Scripps website. You can follow this on Twitter. There is a Twitter account now for the Keeling curve of CO2. It's right down there, Keeling_curve. And this is like the starkest symbol of us. And this is the concentration of this gas in the atmosphere, which is different, of course, than the emissions. The emissions rate is how much we pump out year to year, but it's, as most of you I'm sure know, CO2 is a cumulative gas. It doesn't just sort of go away like smoke after a rainstorm. So we're in a mode of consequence. And the basic physics says the climate is changing and will change. There's still, though, a lot of uncertainty, as we'll talk about. And then, I tried really hard not to get too climate-centric. One of my regrets in moving to ProPublica is that there's this other stuff, like, oh, I didn't plug this back in. Maybe they turned it off. Oh, darn, you're not going to be able to hear that. Oh, you are. So that's Rab's. That's okay. It's good. It's good. It's good. This is Rab's fringe-limbed frog. It's now extinct. And it's kind of like that's a troubling sound, and it should be troubling, because the call is not extinct, because they recorded the call at the Atlanta Botanical Garden before the last member of the species died in Atlanta. There were 2 left in Atlanta, one at the zoo and one at the Botanical Garden, rescued from Central America, from Panama, where this fungus has come through and wiped out so many different species of tropical frogs. And so they recorded the call, but of course it's just the sound. It's a digital vestige. And so I tweeted about this, as you can see there. Will the media soon need an extinction desk to go with the obituaries desk? And I had to write, in 2007, I wrote essentially the obituary for the Baiji, that river dolphin in the Yangtze River. And it's a whole new thing. We didn't have to do that when I was growing up. You didn't have these kind of, and the next one will be the vaquita in Mexico, the little dolphin. And so now, I'm going to take you down a little further, down the downside of the Anthropocene. to the this is, I don't know how many of you are on Twitter or whatever. I saw this. There's an illustrator named Tim O'Brien who came up with this when Kellyanne Conway had her alternative facts moment. And if you look carefully, you can see the people are pancakes. The butterfly, the robin is a butterfly. In other words, it's a classic kids book, but it's all in art alternative facts speak. And we're in a strange juncture, especially for a literate and or scientific community and or journalistic community, to be immersed in a culture now, a moment when facts are malleable is disturbing. And that can lead to us all feeling like this guy. I took this picture in 2009 in Copenhagen at the Copenhagen Climate Talks right after things kind of fell apart. This was a cameraman in the newsroom, and we are all, everyone who's focused on the sustainability question has had this posture at some time or other. And even people outside of the sustainability arena in recent weeks have probably had this posture at some point or other. And here's the good news. This whole thing is my fault. It's my fault. Here's the curve of us, right? And the Great Acceleration started right around when I was born. So if correlation and causation really do mean something, then it means this is all my doing, the Great Acceleration. I was born March 25th, 1956. You can go to this website and plunk in your birth date, and those with you can do that on your device if you want to. And you can find out where you are on the curve of us. So is this journey forward, from here forward, going to be good or bad? Or how can you make a difference on an issue that's said to be super wicked? That's what we'll explore. Very quickly, really quickly, this is part of my journey. Some of the most meaningful reporting I did on climate and sustainability was at the Vatican. That's me. That's not really a selfie, right? When someone else takes your picture while you're taking a picture of somebody, what is that? It's not a selfie. So there I am with the Pope. I was there for this meeting on sustainable humanity, sustainable planet, our responsibility. That was the title of this meeting at the Vatican. And the great thing about it was it brought together a cross-section of humanity. It wasn't just scientists. It wasn't just economists. It wasn't just philosophers. It wasn't just theologians. It wasn't just labor activists and poverty workers. It was everybody for about 1 week. And it was incredibly valuable because it articulated powerfully that science basically only sets the table for these questions. Science is a good way to have some, at least quasi-objective view of the world. And then, but science has some work to do in terms of letting go of that to a certain extent. The choices society makes are a function of all those things: economics, poverty, reflexes, behavior, values. And that means there's no simple, quick path to a common sense of a safer future. And now I really am going to fast forward. I'll skip my journey. This was when I was out on that trip. And it's fun stuff, but we don't have time. I started writing about climate in the mid-'80s. First about nuclear winter. The idea that if you burn enough cities in a nuclear war, you'd end up having not only the catastrophe of the war, but calamitous climate impacts. And Alan Robach at Rutgers and others have still run calculations that even a small regional war like a Pakistan-India nuclear exchange could have a dramatic effect on world agricultural productivity for years. So it hasn't really gone away, but the way we covered, to get the interest, the media had to cover it in this way. We had to show Earth in an ice cube, and then that would be a way to get people to think about it. And then along came the greenhouse effect in 1988, and that was my first cover story on that issue, which has kind of captured me then and never let me go. I didn't grow up wanting to be a climate-focused journalist, but it's an unbelievably tough and interesting story. The weird thing about this story, and a book I then wrote about it a couple of years later, is that almost every single beat, every single theme you'll see in a story about climate change now was clear then. And the long-term scientists in the room know that the basic architecture of this is the same as it has been. The Arctic focus is kind of new, and abrupt climate change wasn't really yet fully absorbed at that time. But in this article, there's a line in this article about China surging and needing to get out of poverty and needing to use more coal, and who are we to tell them not to? So those aspects of it were true even back then. I went to the Amazon in 1989 to write a book about the murder of Chico Mendes, and used that story as the story of the struggle over the Amazon, which was a good way to start to understand that behind most of the things we call environmental problems, there's usually social dysfunction, a lack of governance, a lack of property rights, or who owns this forest. The rubber tappers and Indians who were there were just being forced out at gunpoint by ranchers who had a different definition of progress. And that was, for me, an important learning moment. The Amazon also was this point when I started to sort of see the Anthropocene, the acceleration. Some of you, I know some, I'm not sure if she's here, but at least a couple of people here have done work in Manaus. So I was in Manaus doing some reporting, and this is 1989. And there, you go into a bar and there's a sloth and a soap opera at the same time. Really bizarre. But then this was a sadder image of, there was a funeral parlor where they have coffins in all sizes. This is not a norm here in the United States, obviously. And I hadn't really confronted this aspect of global development fully until around then, when I was interviewing rubber tappers, families, and the mother would say, without really shedding a tear or anything, that, I'd ask her, how many kids you have? She said, well, I had 17, 10 are alive. But she was just like being numerical about it, not being emotional or anything. It wasn't even a sense of injustice or that it was wrong. It was just that was how it works, And that was powerful for me. My book on global warming, the first one, came out in 1992. That didn't work. I could just, if you want to see it, I posted the whole book online. You can read it online. Just Google for Revkin 1992 warming book. And it had this throwaway line. I at the end of a chapter on rising impacts of humans around the world, I wrote this, perhaps Earth scientists of the future will name this new post-Holocene era for its causative element, the Holocene being the period since the last ice age, 11,700 years or so. For us, we are entering an age that might someday be referred to as, say, the Anthropocene. I didn't really think through the roots of that word. If I wanted to create, if you want to create a neologism or whatever, it's good to get the sort of the feel of the word right. Anthropocene is more technically correct. As I said, Anthropocene just felt better. It's a geological age of our own making. And then I was very preachy. The challenge is to avoid, we don't want to be like, we don't have to leave a fossil record like the dinosaurs. That's my preachy moment. And I'll talk about that in a minute too, a little later. It was an interesting time. 1992, the story of climate change still felt like a pollution story at that time. We're emitting gases, they're changing things, there are going to be harms. We just need to restrict them with some kind of instrument, treaty, laws, and that's it. We did that with chlorofluorocarbons, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, that's the model. So that was my first mistake. It was thinking, okay, climate change is a pollution problem. Much, much bigger than that. Skipping some stuff. So I came to the world of daily journalism in the mid-90s. I started at the New York Times, 1995. I was writing about regional pollution, Hudson River, PCBs. And then I moved back into the climate story that I had been covering for so long. And I got to go to the North Pole and to climate talks. And I tried every possible way to tell the story within the evolving framework of doing newspaper reporting. When I went to the North Pole, I brought video cameras and we posted the video, amazing sounds of the sea ice. I was trying to tell the story. In 2005, I went to the Montreal Climate Talks and I did a podcast in 2005. I had forgotten about it until I recently was searching through my old stuff and thought, wow, we had a podcast from the Montreal Climate Talks. And I started a blog, and as you know, .earth started in 2007. But when I went to Greenland in 2004, I did kind of a bloggish, these postcards from the Arctic. So I was trying, which medium might do it? In 2005, we also did a documentary called Arctic Rush, a New York Times Discovery Channel documentary. So I thought, well, we're telling the story in every possible way. People are going to get it, right? And it just hasn't kind of worked out that way, but you'll see. .earth, as I said, kind of started as this experiment in sort of a two-way street form of journalism, interactive with lots of input from readers, and where I was essentially doing kind of an open interrogation of the idea of sustainability more than me reporting on it. And a lot of my posts were questions. Like, here's one that's a question. Can we move from a sprint to a marathon? And what I mean is, can we move from this great acceleration to something different in a purposeful way? Or does nature have to always enforce upon us the limits, like as if we're bacteria growing on agar, on a plate of agar, where the limits of your own waste products hem you in? Can we be smarter than that? And I kept thinking, as we were designing .earth, this guy named Jeremy Zillar, we had a whiteboard. Before we started the blog, we were doing all these, what is this going to be about, Andy? He just kept challenging me. And it was about like this. We're in a race between potency and self-awareness. That's what it is. And I thought, well, if we just become aware of our potency more, then we'll modulate our potency. It seems logical. And then this other learning happened where, again, it felt like we were in many ways, it felt like we're in sort of a two-legged or a three-legged race. We're hampered by these. We have to have all these things happen. It's not just, you have to line up several different things for us to get this right. It felt complicated. And I started to realize there were some problems in my conception of the problem. One was the word we. We look at a global issue like global warming. We know we're all the same species, right? So you think we need to cut emissions 80% by 2050 or whatever, or at least the rich of us. But of course, in the landscape that we face, there is no we. In this sense, there's the we. This is my sister's apartment in New York City. If you want to live anywhere in a developed country with a low carbon impact, live in New York City in a small apartment, right? So, and that's a great example of sustainable living in the 21st century in our world. And she just redid her kitchen, so it's pretty cool. But this also is our world today, the world that Kirk Smith at Berkeley and others focus on so much, which is a couple billion people with no energy choice that's remotely sustainable. The mortality and morbidity rate from household air pollution is terrible. And this woman could use any fuel, like a fossil fuel would be a great substitute for what she is using. So how do you have a we in the treaty process that really captures that full scope of difference? It's hard. Last year I was fortunate to get around the world literally for different reasons. I was in Singapore. I'm sure more than a few people have been to Singapore. How many? Not too many. Have you been to the gardens by the bay? This is this unbelievable place. It's I think it's the world's largest glass-domed botanical gardens, and they have what amounts to I was realizing when I was there what it is. It's a museum of climates. It's like, because they have one that's like a Mediterranean climate. They have olive trees growing at the equator, and it's all dry. They have all kinds of European oregano, whatever. It's amazing, and it's like, this is a tropical one here. This is the cloud forest climate. So as long as you're wealthy and have technology, you can preserve any climate, or you can be comfortable anywhere. And that was the weird thing. You go out and these hermetically sealed doors would kind of whoosh, and then you'd be back out in tropical equatorial Singapore climate. But that's one thing. And then I was in Nairobi, and I know I've talked to a few people here who live or work in Nairobi. I went to two of the slums. The Matari slum here is about 400,000 people, and their main cooking fuel is charcoal. Here you are in the middle of a city, cooking on charcoal. That's wood that was brought in, that was processed somewhere, and most of it, from what I've been reporting, is coming from Somalia, and it's actually financing terrorism and warlords. So I can't imagine a worse fuel than charcoal in Nairobi. It's the worst possible energy situation, and there's a good argument there for a fossil fuel like propane, the liquid LPG, which is the backyard grill gas, to be the thing that could supplant most quickly those fuels in a way that would make their lives much, much better. But I'm doing some reporting right now on there are because of a climate focus being perhaps too intense, there are European development institutions that won't finance that for Kenya because it's a fossil fuel. They're thinking too centrically perhaps about the climate problem. And there's many reasons why that feels like a problem to me. So we have to figure some of these things out. Now here, there's another version of the art. There's no we. There's no we. This is missing a couple of things, but it still works. I was talking about this a lot today with some people here. Cultural cognition is this body of empirical behavioral science. How many behavioral scientists are in the room? Oh, see, one? Wait, just one? That's a problem. Because they are a big chunk of the solution. I don't know, are you in psychology or sociology or what? Yeah, so as I said, my first 20 years of writing about climate change was writing sort of like, greenhouse gases do X. They're changing the heat flows in the planet. They're seas are going to rise, blah, blah, blah. And there are these policy options. And I won a bunch of awards, as you heard. And then around 2005, 2006, I started writing about the behavioral sciences and why we misperceive risk and what are the risks we get right and wrong and why are people so divided when the information is so clear. And it was, as a journalist, it was like a nightmare. It was like opening a door and having some big monster come out and say, you've just wasted 20 years, man. Because this body of work shows that, among other things, and someone here did a small-scale version of this, right, Chris, right? More science literacy can make people more divided over global warming because it's motivated reasoning is this thing. It's where if you have a culture, when your culture is more valuable to you in society than information, then you preserve your cultural identity and your connection to your community by selecting information that fits that pattern. And this is on all ends of the spectrum of how people think. And so the people who are either most infuriated or worried about global warming, who have science background, are able to do that better than the ones in the middle. So it's a bizarre, and that's why you end up Nobel Prize winners in physics, like Ivar Gaever, 1977, Rensselaer, Robert Laughlin, this was Steve Chu. There's Steve Chu, and then Bert Richter, all have very divergent views of the climate problem and what you would do about it if you thought it was a problem. And that says, and it's not just them, it's in society generally. Someone here speaks frequently, Tim Herbert. Yeah, he speaks frequently to well-heeled alumni groups about this issue, and you'll have some well-heeled, very successful, very smart person who can just like fight with you to the death over global warming science, and so that's very depressing, right? And as a journalist, it was particularly depressing, in my 50s, hitting this body of information, saying, well, what do I do with this? And there is an upside. I'll tell you about the upside. But not recognizing it can lead to a life of hitting walls and really, that's why hug a social scientist. Get to know a social scientist. Seriously, any of you who are in some other arena, and it can be a good thing. So I was proposing recently that the best sequel to An Inconvenient Truth is not like whatever just came out, the inconvenient truthier inconvenient, but An Inconvenient Mind. And this is a big chunk of the climate problem is the internal climate. And I'll explain a little bit about why. It's not the only issue. People take advantage of this too. I gave a talk on some of this a few years ago, and a student at Columbia illustrated a point in my talk. I was trying to find a metaphor for the climate problem as it really is, and it felt like, well, there's this giant boulder, and which is society on fossil fuels. It took us 100 years to get here. We kind of like it. I drove here in my Prius, and I'll fly somewhere soon, and it makes my life easy, and fossil fuels keep us warm and cool. 80% of the global energy pie is still fossil fuel. very sober projections say that 80% of a much bigger energy pie in 2030 will still be fossil fuels, even with a lot of progress on renewables. So like, you could say, well, that's all the fault of the fossil fuel companies, or you can say it's that, but it's something bigger, which is inertia and what's called, what do they call it, status quo bias. This is, we all have a presumption that, the world we live in is most likely the world we're going to live in going forward. And it's been kind of good so far, so, we'll stick with that idea because it feels reassuring. And status quo bias is one of those little psychological phenomena that's there. So if you want to change the world, if your job is to decarbonize the economy of the United States by 2050, you have a lot of work to do to get us to nudge that boulder. And if you're what I call an inactivist, if you either like or profit from fossil fuels, or you resist the idea that top-down solutions are the way forward on environmental problems, you just need a feather duster. You can just like stand there and la-di-da, yeah, because you know that we're locked in place. So it's not an even playing field. This is why, to me, even, the media was kind of pilloried for a while as like the problem. Well, if we just write about this the right way on the front page every day, then we'll magically rapidly decarbonize. And the more you learn about energy systems and stuff, it seems like it's a lot harder. And I'm not just kind of taking the heat off the media. The media have done problematic things. This has led, there was this really good, a young researcher named Kelly Levin when she was at Yale. In 2007 or so, she wrote a paper with some other colleagues proposing that climate change is a super wicked problem. I'm sure you know about the concept of wicked problems, which are in economics are ones where if you tweak one knob, something over here happens, and it's an interlaced, complicated system. It's hard to fix. And super wicked took it to a new level. And but her paper came out in 2007. Richard Lazarus, an economist who I think is now at Harvard, when he was at George Washington, he wrote this paper, and I love the subtitle of this paper, Restraining the Present to Liberate the Future, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change, climate policy. It's changing our norms now for the sake of not constraining the future and not having relentlessly rising seas or temperatures and all the other things that come with climate change. But when you look at those words, you realize, again, that's kind of like that's a heavy lift. Restraining the present to liberate the future. And recognizing that, along with these other elements, there's no we have behavioral issues that get in the way, makes it feel less like a two-legged race or something and more like a scrum. Someone here, Brown has a pretty good rugby culture. I don't know, someone must know the rules of rugby, but somehow a scrum has this weirdness where it kind of moves and things happen, but it's like, multidimensional and muddy. And that may be just that may be us, I don't know. And you'll see in a minute, I think there's reason to think it's not so terrible, actually. So design, so what do you do? How do you design when you have a complex system that's really not designable? What can you do? And there's a bunch of opportunities in basic innovation. You can design, this is Klaus Lochner and others at Arizona State are working, this is just one tiny micro example from 1,000. This is a material that when it's in a dry atmosphere, it absorbs CO2. And if you put it in a humid atmosphere, like put it in a greenhouse, it liberates the CO2. And the plants can take it in. And so you could see having some kind of weird sort of conveyor belt, in Arizona that takes CO2 out of the air and into plants and create your fuels and stuff. But this is such a, scale, that word scale comes along. You can do it. And of course, solar, solar thermal, there's many advances coming in solar and the other renewable technologies, new nuclear designs. But their time scale, and there's lots of issues there. And technology on its own is not the solution, as I learned. We have to think about designing policy too, and I'll get to that in a minute. One thing that got crystallized in my head came in 2014 when this guy named Herberto Cabezas gave a talk in New York City at a meeting on climate and civilization. I was running a panel. And he does this very sophisticated complex systems models of the human adventure, where it's got agriculture and population growth and economic models and climate models all kind of integrated. And he runs it for 200 years and sees what comes out the other end. And his conclusions, complicated, but the main conclusion was this. Coordinated manipulation of at least 6 variables is necessary to maintain stability for 200 years or so. As he's saying these words, I was like, WTF. And I was like a kid, I said, can you tell me how that happens in the world we know? Like, who's the master sustainability control knob guy or woman, How does that happen? And this is what he said. It was so interesting. We lack a cultural narrative that says sustainability is really important. We have a cultural narrative that says murder is wrong. We don't have a cultural narrative that says managing our planet in a way that allows us to live on it as long as we can is probably the most important thing. And he's right about that to a large extent. We've had these experiments, the Montreal Protocol, Paris. We're working on it, but it doesn't yet feel like it's a primary objective of the human experiment. And if it is, it won't come from science. A cultural narrative comes from culture and values, and that's what takes me back to the Vatican, where I had some very meaningful experiences I might end with. So when you have a complex system, it's super wicked. There's really no simple solution. When you see that top-down approaches look even almost laughable in that sense, what do you do? What do you do? Well, I thought a lot about that. And I think, numerical goals absolutely matter. We have to have some rough sense of what's safe or not safe. But if you rely too much on numbers, then you can miss, I think, some things to work on. And Paris, as I and so many other people know or have written, was an utter failure and a glorious success. And the failure was that it's non-binding and it's aspirational, just like back in 1992, the Rio Treaty. And it relies a lot on confidence building and just the only legally binding part is that we have to meet every 5 years, basically, that kind of thing. It's not you're obliged to do something. But that's also the strength of it. As I was talking with Timmons and his students earlier, on a planet with no we, with variegated interests and states of development, the only way you can get 195 countries into a room to agree on anything is to make sure it's non-binding. And what Thomas Schelling explained back in the 80s as what he calls soft law or soft diplomacy. Sunstein's nudge, is part of the same concept. And but the failure of it is, as I was saying, there's a huge gap that hasn't been really absorbed. This looks wonky, but it's straightforward. The thing about Paris was it was only from now till 2030. So the commitments, all of the things under Paris were framed around that period. And what you see there is, basically that's business as usual is up at the top for emissions. This is emissions of carbon dioxide. Safe is the blue zone, like down, down, down. And Paris was like, okay, it doesn't really matter, the yellow and the orange and the green. Those were the debating points in Paris for different things. So, but the thing I tried to do was to say, well, how does this play out in the 21st century? So here's Paris. So all that 2020 to 2030 stuff is in that box to the left. And then look at what has to happen after Paris. So it's kind of like, I don't know what it's like. It's like committing to writing a book, but you're only really committing in the contract to write the first 200 pages of a 500-page book. And you don't know how it's going to end, and you don't know how to get to the end. And how do you fill that space in the middle? And remember, this is not happening in a vacuum. What else is happening from 2030 till 2100? Well, humanity is happening. That's Nigeria's population possibilities, UN treaty. UN analysis. The high end is highly unlikely. But the high end, if fertility rates in Nigeria stay where they are, just Nigeria will have 750 million people by later in this century. Just that one country. And Africa, think about that in terms of sub-Saharan Africa and all the issues in Nigeria and climate vulnerability in that part of Africa. And that's all happening while we have to go to zero or below with emissions of CO2. That's a problem that has to be kind of like dealt with, absorbed, almost embraced. So the new goals, to me, are not so much numbers as cultural traits, traits in individuals and in culture. What are the things you could see in society that you think would be helpful in diverting trajectories toward better outcomes? They're out there. They're not like some new technology, because technology is a function of what we aspire to. They're kind of like, they reminded me as I was thinking this through of the options you have in trying to raise a kid. You all have not necessarily had a child yet, but you've all been children at some point. And when you have a kid and you're looking at this baby in the crib and you're thinking, you have two choices. You can kind of say, wow, I want to do everything possible. That I would love my child to be a doctor, and so I'm going to send him to the best school and blah, blah, blah. Or you could say, what are the traits that I can nurture in this child that give him or her the best chance of having a productive, meaningful, and healthy life? And it's kind of the same set of traits. They're like, but that requires, and I don't know of any parent who's been able to do this, letting go, because you all want to control your kid's life. You don't want them to be harmed or in danger. So we tend to want to be like that 6 manipulating variable person for our kids, when you know that everyone has said, no, you just create a safe space and let them run around. And so it's, in theory, this playground at this Hudson Highlands Nature Center my wife used to work at, which is like a nature play place. What you want is for kids to just let them go and let them run around and have a safe space. So how do we do that? What's the culture? What do you nurture? And to me, it came in a tweet. I tweeted this, of course. Oh God, we're going to run out of time, and I don't want to do that. Essentially, I came up with my own shorthand, which was bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal, reflect, rejoice, repeat. Remember, I'm a songwriter on the side, so it's like I haven't turned this into a song yet. It's almost like hip hop or something, but they're basic concepts. I'm going to fast forward through them, but I think you'll know what I mean when I say them. Bend is the one that's almost boringly familiar. It's resilience. But resilience, we think of resilience usually as like a resilient city that can absorb a flood. But I think about adaptability in a person, resilience in a human, is articulated by this guy like Billy Parrish. This picture is from 2005, the Montreal Climate Talks, and a bunch of young energy action activists there. And their role there was to be they were there to be the face of the generation that's going to deal with the climate impacts that we're creating, getting in the face of the negotiators. They're a vital part of these treaty processes, and Brown University has been great at getting students in that arena. But Billy Parrish, between then and now, at a certain point, he was like a salmon swimming up a river, finding your way. There's a rock, so you kind of go this way. He has this goal in mind, but he's got plasticity. He ended up going into finance, and where are solar panels not being built because there isn't capital? And he and a partner came up with a model, Mosaic, a company called Mosaic, joinmosaic.com, that is a way to use for small investors to put in money like you would in your bank account. You get a 4.5% rate of return, which is way better than any bank account. And that capital then is there for low-income housing, for installations of solar panels and stuff. It's still very limited by financial rules in the United States. I think it's just New York and California where it can happen. But it could change. But I like his plasticity, his ability to bend and stretch. Bend, of course, is, this is, it's going to take too much time. Islands can persist for a long time, even in rising seas, low islands. There's a lot of research on this, which is a good thing, right? But if you're developing on an island the way has happened in the Maldives, see, what you're seeing here is like, this is an island that's been around in a part of the Pacific for 100 years through a lot of sea level rise at a rate that's faster than the average sea level rise. And the island has actually gotten bigger just because they're a dynamic system, right? But you have to give it room to do that. So if you build like Male, the capital of Maldives, and I was there way in the early 80s on that sailboat, way before it looked like that, there's no plasticity there, right? You can't, how can you have an island like that that will endure rising seas? It's not possible. So how do we, that's about changing a development model. And I don't know what the answer is there. How do you do that is a good question. I'm going to fast forward. There, you know, so there's so much, I should do like a two-part, like a 2-day set of talks. These are examples of adaptive thinking and arenas that you don't think about. Oh, whoa, that's not, there we go. The one on the right, Scenic Hudson, which is, Scenic Hudson is a nonprofit in the Hudson Valley, like a land trust. And what they're doing is anticipatory conservation. The Hudson Valley has lots of these marshes and estuaries that in 50 years or 100 years will be bays, right? This is a tidal river, so as seas are rising. So they're already looking for landowners who have land that will be the next marsh. And starting now to negotiate with them in sort of like a legacy way. We would like, you know, when your land is more of a marsh, we would like to have the easement there to maintain bird habitat in the Hudson Valley. And that is, to me, a very fundamentally new way of thinking about conservation. There are people doing that with polar bears. Stephanie Furman at Barnard and others are looking at polar bear conservation in the Arctic through the 21st century with the same kind of where will sea ice persist in the Arctic, and that's already pretty clear. You know, around Greenland, between Greenland and Ellesmere Island, places like that. So those are zones right now where you start to build conservation policies that can target the areas where we know the polar bear's habitat will persist. Very interesting new ways of looking at things. So that's bend, stretch. I'm going to really fast forward. You know we need more research. Twitter, we were talking about this earlier. The hashtag is Twitter is your friend. Even now, even with how it's been exploited, I guess, by our president. There are ways to build communities that are actually functional and forward-looking and can do meaningful things, not just use it to confuse or anger or distort. Twitter, there's a lot of noise, and this is not just Twitter, but social media generally. But a hashtag is one of those things that can give you a signal in the noise. If you are interested in telling the story of science to the public, there's a hashtag, I am a scientist because, which is really cool. I wrote about that a couple of years ago when I stumbled onto it. And it's people, scientists who say, most of the time when someone asks you if you're a scientist about your work, you say, what do you do? And you'll say, well, I model sea ice. And you get right into the math of it right away. And not, if it's, why do you do what you do? That's a much more interesting question. I'm a sea ice modeler because is a more interesting and engaging question for an average person than what is sea ice. So thinking about how to engage with the public is a way forward. And these are all really interesting hashtags for communities. Farm hack is young farmers, small scale farming, trading tips on how to use technology to make traditional farming methods more productive and sustainable. So you can have that hybrid approach going forward. But if you're sharing ideas this way, it's a much more productive path. There are ways to get past the psychological barriers are also opportunities. Climate disputes, as I said earlier to some people, often hide energy agreement. And this study from Yale really shows that pretty clearly. When you ask people about how much they worry about global warming, the country is very variegated, right? Lots of different colors. But the most important thing about this graph is the colors are all pastel colors, right? This is not an issue except for a very small group of people that's deeply engaging. But when you ask the same people, do you support regulating CO2 as a pollutant, at least in 2014, the whole country was yes. Like, where's the red state, blue state thing there? And this has been, people have dug in a little bit more on this, and it is real. It's, maybe it's there's questions about it, but it's real. Here's a percentage of adults who support funding research into renewable energy sources. All yes. Where is our, I thought we were all like at each other's throats on this stuff. And that says to me that we're missing opportunities. Sometimes coming in, barreling in and saying, hey, you climate deniers, why don't you get on board my ship, the climate concern ship? When you think about the cultural cognition work, you realize that really has some limits. And talking about smart energy choices can have a very different outcome. Teaching, new models for teaching, there's so many opportunities. There's a school, public high school in the Bronx, the High School for Energy and Technology. That's one of these sort of targeted schools that the kids go, they do a boiler room tour as part of their schooling. And the guy giving the lecture on this day was the custodian, which even that is a wonderful thing, a cross-cultural experience. And he's telling them, that in this school 25 years ago, we were shoveling coal into the furnace. That's how we kept it hot. Most New York City schools burned coal until like just 20, 25 years ago. Amazing. And so learning about your school as a system, using the school not just as a place to have a chalkboard, but as a system you can study and learn from is great. Transparency, Reveal is about transparency. There's so much ability to impose transparency now. This is, you think about if you're worried about methane emissions from fossil fuel operations and you're not using an infrared camera, you're missing a big opportunity. This is the same tank, same day. That's, wow, that's it's kind of rusty, right? And that's the same place, same day. Different wavelength of light, different story. And that's your friend if you want to tell the story about opportunities to cut leaks of methane and other volatiles. The Volkswagen story is a great example of the ability to impose reality. And I'm sure you know the basic parameters. Essentially, a very small laboratory at West Virginia University with a tiny bit of funding from a small nonprofit group, the ICCT.org. They just tested cars, and it wasn't they weren't going out to take down Volkswagen. They were doing some kind of garden variety testing, but then they recognized there's a huge deal here. These cars were emitting so many, like order of magnitude more pollutants than their computers were saying, and they dug in on that, and that has upended the auto industry in a way that's going to reverberate for a long time to come. You can't cheat as easily anymore. There's so many arenas now. And think about remote sensing and gas emissions. The scientists are developing rapidly the ability to do global tracking of point sources of CO2 or methane in ways that are going to make the treaty process more honest. But getting back to these guys, I don't know if you read, there was a story in the New York Times last year. Remember, there's been multi-billion-dollar settlements over what happened, right? But the small lab that did this is struggling right now. The New York Times had an article. They're struggling still to keep in business, this lab at West Virginia University. They didn't get any of that reward. There's no incentive out there to make perhaps this part of how we do environmental quality in this country. With EPA, whether or not it's under attack from Republicans, it's a limited model for having for making sure environmental progress is sustained. And we have all this distributed capacity to do this stuff. And here's a model for it. 51 years ago, in the Hudson Valley, some fishermen, commercial fishermen, and Bob Boyle, who was a writer for Sports Illustrated, but very focused on conservation, they were digging through these old laws, seeing all the pollution along the Hudson River. And there were these two laws that they found from the last century, from the last century, that where they offered a bounty. If you were a citizen and you saw someone dumping something in the waters of the United States, you could actually profit. You could get a reward in a settlement. And that's how the Hudson River Fishermen's Association and then Riverkeeper was formed, with money they got in settlements from identifying when ships were dumping stuff in the river. Fantastic innovation. And that was what the Croton Point Park looked like along the Hudson River in the 60s when the Clearwater was starting to sail. So now can we develop a model for that for atmospheric, for air pollution? It would be interesting to see if there's a way. And that's a model that Republicans actually would probably like. It fits with their aspects of how conservatives look at things. Bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal, reflect. Reflect is like thinking about when things aren't working, what can we do better? And this is even within scientific disciplines. This is what I was saying earlier about hug a sociologist or whatever. Making sure you're reaching out for insights that might help you solve the problem you're working on across disciplines and among disciplines. USGS has this really interesting facility up in the Rockies, the John Wesley Powell Center for Analysis and Synthesis, something like that. That's their Twitter account, where the examples are really interesting. Scientists locked in some battle over important bit of science go there, and usually for multiple meetings, and they work out they hash things out. But what they do is it's like 6,000 foot altitude. They go on hikes, and you can't yell at each other when you're out of breath. And they have a rule, the Powell blood oath, where when you're in your little meetings talking about statistical headaches, when you give your 5-minute presentation, you have to end. The last minute has to be articulating your opponent's point of view. You have to state the point of view of your critics as your wrap up to your talk. And it's all this like lubrication that helps work out ways to get over some of those like hard knocks. It's really cool. I'm going to just Google for response diversity in Revkin, and you'll get the idea there. Response diversity is good. I want to close on the Vatican. So after a week there, hashing out sustainable humanity, sustainable planet, our responsibility. Remember, there were scientists and theologians and everybody. I was lucky enough to be sitting next to Walter Monk, who at that time was 96. He's an oceanographer famed for many things, including helping with the victory over the Nazis by working out a wave model for the beachhead landings in Europe. And he was there, and I was there. That's Paul Crutzen. Paul Crutzen was there, and so I'm sitting with Walter Monk after dinner, and I said, "So Walter, how's this going to work out? So what do you think? How can we get through this century? What's going to take?" And I think I had in my mind, he was a physical oceanographer. He's still going, and I figured he'd come up with something like geoengineering or, fusion or something. And he turned to me and he said, It'll take a miracle of love and unselfishness. I couldn't believe it. The words just reverberated in my head because, he's like the ultimate quant. He lives numbers, but he recognized that, again, a big chunk of this path forward be determined by values, and unselfishness is a very interesting word to use in that context. That gets back to what Richard Lazarus's super wicked problems, restraining the present to liberate the future. Those are issues of equity and on time scales that we're not used to. And how that works out, we still don't know. But it's certainly worth doing. I know I've run 5 minutes over, and I do want to talk. I don't know if we have time. Dan Kamen and Michael Dove, Dan at Berkeley, Michael Dove at Yale. In 1997, so 20 years ago, they wrote a paper about the virtues of mundane science. I was talking to a physical scientist here. Oh, yeah, Brian Marston, about this. This is the idea that, some of our fields might merit reassessing how much focus on new knowledge, frontier knowledge, versus applicable knowledge. Where's the right balance there? And this doesn't come down to individual scientists. It's about departments and how you judge tenure, and all those models are still not torqued toward useful science for the most part. It's like it's torqued toward frontier breakthrough knowledge, and figuring that out this is a good time to think about that more and more. And there are examples of it. Jennifer Burney, who was at Stanford, was working on incorporating solar into women's agricultural cooperatives, where a solar-powered drip irrigation system really is transformative there, and it's really low tech. You don't even need a battery because it just runs when there's sunlight, and that's when you need the water most, when it's hot and sunny. Finding those things. The Future Earth is a very interesting initiative related to this. I was on the engagement committee there initially. Rejoice is on my list, making sure that making sure that in urban policies there's room for nature left over for kids to learn what mud is, and then the last thing is repeat. That's the last word, and that's discipline. The discipline of keeping at it. The thing that people miss about Bill McKibben, to my mind, is that his messaging is all urgent, urgent, urgent. Now it's like go to war, go to war. But when you look at his life and how he's lived his life, it's an endurance. He's an endurance athlete. Oh shoot! What just happened? Hold on. Where did it go? I just saw it. Hold on. Did you see a slide with his books on it? That's so weird. Woo. It's here. Well, anyway, I'll tell you about it. And then I'm going to close with that. Bill wrote a book. That's really weird. I think it's in my computer somewhere. He wrote a book called Long Distance that probably no one other than a few thousand people ever read. It was about a year he spent learning how to ski, endurance skiing, when his father was sick or dying. I can't remember. And it's about the long haul. And Bill's life is a better thing to study than his rhetoric sometimes. I think if people focus on that, they'll see there's a really good pattern there of discipline and agility. Remember, like Billy Parrish, he tried journalism, that didn't work. He tried activism with 350, and he's moving on to new frontiers now. So it's the quality it's that journey process that's reflective of, I think, the attributes that are needed going forward. And we really don't know, are we going to burn out? Are we going to glow on? This is the slow-mo guys. They just do weird things on YouTube. This is a bunch of match heads burning. And to me, that kind of reflects where we've been so far. We're more like a match head burning right now than we are like a long glow of an LED. That's Dean Kamen's house out on that island off of the coast here. Is the LED glow or the burnout? It's kind of up to everyone in the room. And I'm going to leave the last word, and it just went on.
How confident are you that we can act for the sake of a future planet that's there mostly for our forebears, our successors?
This is the sort of thing that I have hopes for, but I wouldn't even venture a prediction. This is humanity's final exam, and just like you don't really know how well the students will do on the questions until you get the exams back. I don't think we'll really have the answer for 100 years. I certainly know that there's enough goodness and enough innovative potential in humanity to solve this problem, and the consequences of not doing it right are bigger than I think any other thing that humanity has faced. So I'll just say I have hope, but I won't have a prediction. I know we can do this, but I just have no way of assessing whether we will.
I think that's kind of where we're at, so get to it. And let me know what you think. If we have time for a few minutes of questions, I know we ran over, but here we are. Thank you very much.
So feel free to run. If you would like to ask a question, we have 2 microphones. Things are being recorded, so please step up to one of those if you'd like.
Hi. So one of your pieces of advice for scientists was hug a sociologist, and that made me laugh. I was wondering if you had any other pieces of advice you'd like to share that you think scientists need to hear that you haven't already talked about in your talk.
Sure. Well, I mentioned that the hashtag I'm a scientist because I think right now especially there's so much polarization even around science with what's happened with the political upheaval here. Within the scientific community, for example, on the March for Science, a bunch of my friends are going, but I know a bunch of people who are not going and are really worried that they'll send the wrong signal. So what's the message scientists should be conveying to the public? Which public? Should it be local? Should it be going to Washington? Should people be marching to their should they be marching with signs about Trump, or should they be marching as a celebration of science? Those are all open questions. But the more articulation there is of that hashtag line, I am a scientist because, I think the better off everyone will be. Because it's the human part. I'm a curious person, and here's this mystery of the thing that makes me here's what makes me interested about sea ice or about whatever your thing is. It's the thing you can capture people's attention with. And then the other thing is engaging even on policy. I've written quite a bit about this. If you can be a scientist and be a human being too. You're allowed to do that. I know many people are stressed out. Well, I don't want to weaken my scientific credential by taking a position on nuclear power or whatever, or on Trump. But you can do it. Just articulate it in 2 sentences. Even on climate, sometimes it doesn't happen where you say, I'm a climate scientist. I study clouds and energy. And I'm also a parent and a voter. And in that arena, I think we should have a carbon tax, or I think we should, whatever your thing is. But separating your expertise, the expertise about sea ice or the thing, whatever the thing is, doesn't necessarily give you more authority on the policy decision. And just speaking in 2 sentences can be a way to do both and retain your credibility as a scientist and retain sort of a place in society that doesn't feel like you're always waiting for that you're going to screw up in some way. It's sort of liberating, I think. There's many, many other things. The mundane science thing is, what do I work on? Choosing your focus is really an interesting question going forward.
So I was very interested in hearing what you say.
I think they want you to use the mic to microphone for the recording.
So you were talking about this difference when you use a different language to communicate to deniers, where one is to say CO2 as a pollutant, another way is to say, causing a global warming. It doesn't get accepted to say global warming, but it's more acceptive if it's saying it's pollutant. But if you just follow the question a little bit more, they will say, what does a pollutant do? Then the pollutant, then you go back to the original question. How would you explain that?
Well, that one slide, that's one that I don't have a lot of enthusiasm about. Just to be clear, because at the local level, it would translate eventually into. It's one thing to say we need to regulate CO2 as a pollutant. It's another thing to say it'll be a law that will raise your energy prices. As soon as people become more clear on what the impact of that would be on their lives, that's when the fights would start. So that's a message that I don't think I would count on carrying fully forward, just like you're implying, as you get more dug in on it. The other ones on renewable incentives for renewables and renewable research, and those things are very powerful. And there was a separate, I could show you, if you go online, there's a video a guy recorded in Oklahoma, in Woodward County, Oklahoma, which is the most skeptical county in America, apparently, on global warming. And they found people who are that they will never be worried about global warming. Never. They're so clearly framed culturally to think that that's not possible. But then the conversation, the second half of the video is about energy. And this guy who owns a small oil company said he already has half of his roof covered in solar panels, and he wants to get off the grid entirely, which is really cool. And this is a guy who just like a minute earlier said, only God controls the climate. And everything he's doing on the energy front is not because of global warming. He wants to get off the grid because he's libertarian, because his philosophy is one of he doesn't want to be dependent on anybody, and he doesn't want anybody telling him what to do. So he definitely doesn't want Hillary Clinton, and he doesn't want to be paying bills to his utility if he can produce his own energy. And I'm like, yeah, so let's talk about clean energy. And there's many situations I've seen where if the conversation is about clean energy or all those kinds of renewable options, you can have a much deeper and broader conversation than if it starts with, you have to be concerned about climate like I am, and then we can talk about solutions. It's hard. It's hard to like do that, because if your concern is mostly climate change, you really have to actively change how you're interacting with people. And it's hard. It's hard for a lot of my friends, and even me. It's hard. I've been in situations. Just 2 days ago, I interviewed Will Happer, this Princeton physicist. He's a member of the National Academy. He's a member of JASON's, this high-powered bunch of brains who do classified analysis for the government. And he thinks CO2 is great. He loves CO2. And you know, if I stopped right then and just started a big argument with him about that, it would have taken up the rest of the interview. But then I said, well, you know, what about climate science? Maintaining our ability to understand environmental change. And he's like went on and on. Yes, absolutely. We need to have he says Congress is really bad. They never spend money to sustain systems. We're in a country that likes to create things, but we don't maintain them, and we need to maintain even the Keeling record. And this is a guy who thinks, you know, for whatever reason, he rejects that CO2 is a risk, but he's profoundly wants more science on understanding environmental dynamics and stuff. He may be Trump's science advisor. We don't know yet. But you know, so you could go at that in a way that says, screw this, the guy is my enemy for the rest of my life, or you could say, well, maybe we can figure out at least how to sustain earth science budgets, even if we can disagree about, we're not going to have regulations on CO2 in a Trump administration, but let's at least maintain the capacity to understand the planet and what's happening in a time of consequence. So those are the kinds of things that I think where there is the possibility of some kind of path forward.
So, if you would like to ask any more questions, we're going to have refreshments over in GC 150 as normal after a DEEPS talk.